Toronto ambulance, where do you need us?
In the Eaton Center in the food court downtown at Yonge and Dundas. Someone is just shot and he's in front of me.
A shooting at a downtown shopping mall in Canada's largest city causes panic as it unfolds.
Where was he shot?
In the chest. He was shot at least 8 times.
8 times, okay.
Global News has learned the 22-year-old now fighting for his life was arrested in 2007 at Riverdale Park for armed robbery. He was also charged with second-degree murder in relation to the killing of a Don jail inmate.
In Toronto this week, a family was torn apart when they lost yet another member to bullets.
This latest victim is 21-year-old Nisan Nirmalendran, and astonishingly, he's the second to be murdered in his family. The two cases aren't related, but speaks to a circle of violence so frequent it's now begun to intersect.
All right, we have the ambulance coming. I'm just going to ask
There's someone else also on the ground.
Toronto is a city known for its diversity, its opportunities, and its promise of a better life, but for some, the city holds a darker reality, one often overshadowed by its glimmering skyline. This is the story of 3 brothers whose lives took them down a path they could not escape. From an early age, the Nirmalendrans' lives were shaped by violence. The family is from Sri Lanka, with the 3 brothers born in the early 1990s. At the time of their birth, the country was in a drastic upheaval. From the early 1980s on, ethnic tensions marred the island nation. A freedom fighting group called the Tamil Tigers butted heads with the Sri Lankan government in hopes of building an independent state. The government, however, refused to negotiate. Instead, they escalated the conflict into an all-out civil war. What ensued was a near 6-decade-long genocide against many Sri Lankan Tamils that saw more than 200,000 deaths. Seeking refuge, many Tamils escaped their war-torn homes for other countries, primarily Toronto, which is now considered to house the largest population of Tamil people outside of Sri Lanka. The Nirmalendrans, a family of 5 with 3 boys, were part of that wave of immigration. When the Nirmalendran family arrived in Toronto, neither parent spoke English, and they still struggle with the language to this day. Vigneswari Nirmalendran, the matriarch of the family, remembered coming to Canada with her 3 young sons in the early 1990s. Nixon was 4, Nisan 3, and Nirusan 18 months. They first lived in Scarborough before relocating to Canada's oldest housing project, Regent Park. We came here and struggled to bring them up well, but no one thinks about that, Vigneswari said during a court hearing. When they arrived to Regent Park, the brothers enrolled at Spruce Court Public School where they got accustomed to the Western life fairly quickly. Mohsin Khan, a former friend and classmate of the brothers, talked about how he would play Beyblades with Nisan and basketball with Nixon. Mohsin and Nixon's friendship continued into the early 2000s when they enrolled at Central Tech High School. This is where they met Alwy, another Regent Park native who was a few years older than them. According to loved ones, Alwy was always making people smile with his jokes that sometimes weren't even funny, but you couldn't help but laugh at them. He was always caring to his family and friends. If you needed anything, and if he had it, he would gladly give it. While being a full-time student at Central Tech High School, he was working a part-time job and had aspirations of becoming a mechanic. Being in grade 12 with just a few credits shy of graduating, Alwy was well underway of achieving his dreams. Unfortunately, on one ominous Halloween night in 2007, he made a decision that would change his life and the lives of others around him forever.
These officers of the law are trained to apprehend their suspects in many different ways without having to draw their weapon. But it seems they are quick to pull the trigger. This past Halloween night, they took the life of my friend Alwy. He was shot in the neck by a female officer after a brief encounter. His family and friends still mourn his death, but sadly this has not been the first event of this kind. But we are fighting to make it the last one.
It's October 31st, 2007, and Halloween is in full effect in Toronto. People are dressed up and enjoying the annual festivities, but for friends Alwy and Nixon, well, they had other plans. The duo planned on going to Riverdale Park to rob people for their belongings. Unbeknownst to them, numerous officers had been assigned to that area in anticipation of an increase in robberies on Halloween night. In fact, By the time Alwy and Nixon got to Riverdale Park, 4 robberies had already been reported to police. Alwy and Nixon arrived to the park at around 9 p.m., masked up and armed with a pellet gun which resembled a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. By 9:30, they began enacting the robbery. 25-year-old Nathisan was standing outside the pool entrance of Riverdale Park with 2 friends when they were approached by Alwy and Nixon. Nixon, holding the pellet gun, demanded Nathisan to empty his pockets, which he did. A Metro Pass which was set to expire that night and a gold chain were all that Nathisan had, so the gun-toting duo scurried off to find other victims. But just as they were about to get away, they heard a man shout, "Freeze, drop it, Toronto police." Surprised by the police, Nixon dropped the pellet gun and dropped to the ground, with one officer pointing his service weapon at him. Alwy, however, decided to make a run for it. He took no more than 3 steps before an officer stopped him dead in his tracks. A struggle ensued, then a shot was fired. In the end, 18-year-old Alwy was killed. What followed were protests across the city demanding the termination of the officers involved in the death of Alwy, claiming what they did was unlawful since Alwy was unarmed. The increasing pressure against Toronto's police service forced them to conduct an internal investigation. After careful review of the case, the Special Investigations Unit released the following statement. While struggling to hold Alwy with his left hand, the officer tried to use his service pistol to strike him in order to stop Alwy from struggling. Alwy did not stop. Indeed, he grabbed the gun and then the struggle became one for control of the officer's gun. The officer could not pull the gun away from Alwy and feared that he was going to lose control of it completely. The SIU investigation established that the officer fired 1 shot after failing to wrestle control of his gun away from Alwy. The bullet entered Alwy's neck, passed through his left lung, and exited through his back. He was transported to St. Michael's Hospital where he passed that night. The officers involved in the shooting were cleared of any wrongdoing, and Nixon, who was 16 at the time of the incident, was subsequently charged with robbery. It was his first charge and unfortunately not his last. Following Alwy's death, Nixon would get a tattoo of Alwy's face on his arm with the tribute "R.I.P. Alwy" under the image. Seeing his friend killed had a profound impact on Nixon. That impact likely caused a ripple effect that reached his brothers, who had looked up to their older brother throughout their young lives. Nixon's friend Mohsen remembers Nixon being stoic in the face of the trauma, not expressing an iota of emotion. O'Neill Edwards was a mentor for an innovative program in Regent Park called Pathways to Education. It's a program that aims to give young people from marginalized communities access to higher education. Nixon was in his 3rd cohort in the program, and Edwards remembers speaking to Nixon following the death of Alwy. "It was just so sad," he said. He said his pleas to Nirmalendran to stay away from crime just bounced off him by that point. He had become too hard to reach. The changes in Nixon were subtle, but Edwards could see him changing before his eyes. 10 months after Alwy's death, on August 25, 2008, Toronto police received detailed information from a confidential source alleging that Nixon was dealing from his bedroom window in the low-rise apartments of Regent Park. The confidential source claimed to have personally purchased from Nixon and to have direct knowledge of his ongoing criminal activities. The source not only knew where Nixon lived, he knew the basic layout of the apartment. He knew that Nixon lived there with his mother, father, and 2 younger brothers. The informant indicated that he had purchased directly from Nixon on more than one occasion at the apartment and had even seen a white bag of that he kept under his bed. In an apparent effort to confirm the value of this information, the police were able to determine from their own files that Nixon did in fact live at the address, that he was out on bail under a modified form of house arrest with respect to the Halloween robbery, and that he was under surveillance by the homicide squad with respect to an unrelated incident in 2007. Without taking further investigative steps to confirm the value of these allegations, they applied for, and were granted, a no-knock search warrant to attend the Nirmalendran residence that night and forcibly enter the residence without prior warning or announcement. It would appear from the material filed that the warrant was issued within 15 to 20 minutes of being requested, and within an hour, the police attended the residence and executed the warrant. The warrant was executed at about 11:30 that night by forced entry into the home. The police found, as expected, a quantity of and some cash. In addition, they also discovered a loaded 9mm semi-automatic handgun. Nixon was subsequently charged with a variety of offenses relating to the illegal possession of these items, and because he was 18 at the time of his arrest, he was sent to Toronto's most infamous jail, the Don.
Wow, this is
really small. Can I go in?
Certainly, you'll see how small it is.
Yeah, this is tiny. This is tiny for one person.
And there were times in the history of the jail when there were multiple inmates in some of the cells because of crowding.
Multiple inmates in this tiny
They would
room.
have to share space, sleep in shifts, a whole range of things. What I want to show you now is a segregation cell that goes back in the history of the building a little ways. So this is a space that was used to tuck people away if they were in danger from other inmates or if they'd been bad. So this is a very tight space if you want to squeeze in there.
This is scary for me even now.
But it would have been dark, it would have been cold, and you wouldn't have heard a thing.
This is what it would feel like.
The Don Jail, commonly referred to as the Don, has an infamous history full of bloodshed, violence, and death. Inmates were forced to endure deplorable conditions for months on end. Overcrowding, abusive inmates and officers, combined with the inmates' increasing mental health issues, resulted in constant prison violence that went unresolved for decades. Nixon Nirmalendran landed here at just 18 years old and got accustomed to the prison ecosystem quick, some might even say, a little too quick. This is where 24-year-old Kevon Phillip enters the story. Kevon Phillip was incarcerated at the Don since 2009 on charges relating to stolen cars and was set to face deportation to Trinidad after being convicted of sexual assault in a separate case. Fellow inmates referred to him as a bully, which makes sense, considering his nickname was Muscles. He was known to steal clothing and food from weaker inmates and assault those who crossed his path. Due to his aggressive behavior and his involvement in an assault on another inmate, Kevon was transferred to a different range of the Don sometime in December of 2009. On January 1, 2010, he returned to his original range and was placed in cell 16 with Abdi Mohammed and Hussein Nur. Mr. Phillip did not want to be in this cell, and that night he was agitated and made noise about wanting to return to his old cell. Mr. Phillip's agitation about his cell location continued on the morning of January 2, 2010. At this point, Phillip's behavior escalated into him running around the range and challenging everyone on the range to a fight. At approximately 2:15 p.m. that same day, Mr. Phillip was attacked by a number of individuals. Mr. Brian Smith, an inmate on the range, provided the most detailed information about the attack. Mr. Smith testified that Mr. Phillip was in the area of cell 13 when an inmate by the name of Christopher Farron grabbed him by the neck and put him in a chokehold. The validity of this statement is questionable, considering another inmate testified that he saw Nixon initiate the attack on Mr. Phillip. We'll get back to this point later on. What ensued was a brutal beating of Mr. Phillip by 6 inmates: Nixon, Hussein Nur, Nathaniel Grant, Christopher Farron, Abdi Mohammed, and Said Mohammed. Phillip was choked until he passed out, at which point Hussein Nur punched him in the face area, saying something to the effect of, "Did you think you could come back and run things? Did you think things were going to go back to the same way as they were before?" Mr. Phillip then fell and his head hit the floor. He was then taken to cell 18, the only cell that was open on the range. Inmates testified that after Mr. Phillip was dragged into the cell, they heard noises that sounded like stomping or thumping. One inmate also testified that he heard Mr. Phillip yell out, "Is this how you guys are doing me?" About 15 to 20 minutes after Mr. Phillip was dragged into the cell, his limp body was dragged to the shower area of the facility. Abdi Mohammed then instructed some inmates to clean up cell 18. An inmate who was forced to clean the cell testified that there was blood all over the walls and floor. He used sheets, towels, and water to clean up the blood. Once the cell was cleaned, Abdi wrapped Mr. Phillip in a blanket and left him in the cell. Sometime after 3 p.m., the correctional officers saw Mr. Phillip lying on a mattress at the front of the unit, wrapped in a blanket. A medical alert was called, and over the next few minutes, other correctional officers arrived and entered the cell area. When the correctional staff first saw Mr. Phillip, they noted that he had no pulse and no vital signs. He was lying on his back with his eyes open. He had injuries to his face and the back of his head, but given the absence of blood, it looked like he had been cleaned up. Despite attempts at CPR, Mr. Phillip did not respond and was declared dead a short time later. All inmates were then instructed to return to their cells. All did, except Nixon, who went into cell 16 with Abdi and Hussein. Once all the inmates were in their cells, correctional officers approached cell 16, which had been Mr. Phillip's cell, and moved Nixon, Abdifada, and Hussein into cell 4. The concern was that as this had been Mr. Phillip's cell, the staff wanted to protect and preserve any potential evidence. Upon transferring them to cell 4, the officers took their shoes. Nixon's shoes and jumper were wet and had blood on them. When asked about his wet clothing, he said he had just taken a shower. When the officers left the cell, they heard Nixon laughing. After a thorough investigation, officers identified Nixon, Hussein Nur, Nathaniel Grant, Christopher Farron, Abdifada Mohammed, and Said Mohammed as the main culprits in the brutal beating of Kevon Phillip. They were all charged with second-degree murder. In court, the Crown argued there was direct evidence linking Nixon to the attack on Mr. Phillip, but their stance relied heavily on a statement provided by an inmate named Ryan Wise. Mr. Wise was a problematic witness. At first, he denied having any memory of the attack on Mr. Phillip and did not want to review his statement to the police to refresh his memory. Then, during a cross-examination, he claims he saw Nixon initiate the attack on Mr. Phillip by putting him in a sleeper hold. This is in stark contrast to the Crown star witness and fellow inmate Brian Smith's testimony, who claims Abdifada was the one who initiated the attack on Phillip. Due to the inconsistencies, Nixon was cleared of second-degree murder along with Said Mohammed. However, Justice Brian Trafford charged Abdifada, Christopher Farron, Hussein Nur, and Nathaniel Grant with manslaughter. They were delivered sentences of 2 to 4 years each for the death of Kevon Phillip. Nixon's troubles with the law were just beginning. After being released from the Don in late 2011, he went right back into a life of crime, this time with his brother, Nisan. According to court documents, the brothers were charged with forcible entry and assault in October 2011. Although they received a suspended sentence for the incident, the duo's crimes were getting drastically more violent. Come February 2012, they would be involved in the brutal beating of their childhood friend and fellow Regent Park native, Christopher Husbands. Christopher Husbands had an incredibly turbulent childhood. He was born February 24, 1989 in Guyana and moved to Toronto in December 2000. Since his parents were divorced, Christopher stayed with his mother. Unfortunately, she developed a serious drug addiction and became HIV positive. This is when he moved in with his father in Regent Park. In Regent, he heard about and saw countless violent incidents, including stabbings and shootings. He also noted that it was not uncommon to see people with guns in the area. Sometimes older guys would ask younger ones to hold onto guns for them. Christopher held onto guns in this scenario and sometimes hid them. He would receive $20 to $50 as payment for doing so. There was lots of drug activity and a significant police presence in the area. Many people in his community, including himself, did not have a positive relationship with the police. He describes himself as being a victim of constant police harassment. He recounts being held at gunpoint, slammed against walls, insulted for his skin color, and called racial slurs by 51 division officers. The mistreatment by the police caused him serious mental health issues, and in order to cope, he began abusing marijuana in middle school. Christopher's time in school wasn't easy. He was bullied and involved in several fights as a result of said bullying. He eventually met Nixon in grade 7 and the two became friends. Although Christopher was kicked out the following year for a fight, the two remained friends since they both lived in Regent Park. They were even enrolled in the same Pathways program and mentored by O'Neill Edwards. By 2009, however, Christopher's life entered a downward spiral. He started dealing marijuana and racked up several charges pertaining to drug possession and violating court orders. By 2012, Christopher and Nixon's friendship began to wither as well. According to Christopher, it was because Nixon believed he was involved in a home invasion at the Nirmalendran residence, but Christopher insists he wasn't involved. Regardless, the two remained in contact. In fact, shortly after Nixon was released from the Don jail, he messaged Christopher asking him for a loan so he could buy drugs and resume his drug dealing around the neighborhood. On February 28, 2012, Nixon asked Christopher to bring $150 and some drugs to an apartment on Girard Street. The particular unit he was supposed to go to belonged to a former lover of his, so he assumed he was safe. Sadly, he was mistaken. Unexpectedly, when he arrived to the unit, a group of 6 men dragged him inside and put a mask over his head. A few minutes went by when one of the assailants removed his face covering. It was Ahmed Nuri, another friend of Christopher Husband's. Christopher began to look around the room to identify the other assailants, and what he saw shocked him to his core. To the right of him was the teenage son of his former lover. To the left were Nixon and Nisan. "You're a snake. This is all your fault," said Nisan. "What did I do?" replied Christopher. Ahmed Nuri then presses the barrel of a big heavy handgun to Christopher's temple and said, "45 to the dome." Nuri then begins gun-butting Christopher. While kicking and yelling in defense, Husbands is hauled towards the bathroom where he can hear water running. They bind what looks like green painter's tape around his legs, hands, and head. They then dragged him to another room in the back of the apartment, demanding the money and drugs Nixon asked him to bring. Christopher turns it all over. On the floor, he's in agony. His back especially is screaming in pain. He thought the assailants were stomping on his back, when in fact, he's being stabbed, 35 times to be exact. When it was all over, most of the assailants left, except for two, the Nirmalendrans. Christopher can hear them whispering from somewhere, then a door squeaks. Husbands decided this was his chance to run, maybe the only chance he might get. So he staggers to his feet, reeling out of the apartment and down the hall, knocking on a door for help, but got no answer. He then decides to run to the stairwell and try to get to the store across the street before it closes because he knows the couple that runs it. He managed to make his way out of the building, but before he can get to the store, he collapsed to the ground in the middle of the road, where a stunned passerby called an ambulance for him. Christopher Husbands later told police that he did not know or recognize any of his attackers. That wasn't true, but he knew better than to break the unwritten code of silence in Regent Park. Since this incident, Christopher not only suffers from severe PTSD, but he also carried a gun wherever he went. According to him, he carried only for protection, but come June 2, 2012, it became clear he carried for revenge. On June 2, 2012, Christopher Husbands went to the Eaton Center with his girlfriend Lachelle John. He was wearing a black satchel strapped across his body, and inside was a fully loaded handgun. After shopping for a while, him and his girlfriend went to the food court. It was 6:30 in the afternoon, and there were around 750 people in the food court and over 4,000 in the entire mall. Christopher was standing in the corner near the Sushi Q restaurant while Lachelle John was purchasing her food. Seconds later, cameras caught the moment 5 men, Nixon, Nisan, Ahmed Nuri, Robert Kata, and Ahmed Hassan entered the Eaton Center. At the time, Hassan was wanted on drug charges, Robert Kata was let out from jail due to a clerical error, and Ahmed Nuri was out on charges pertaining to a raid. They made their way down to the food court by the escalator and walked past Husbands. Lachelle John, who was just a few feet away, heard Christopher yell, "What?" Robert Kata then yelled back, "What's up?" in a rude manner. According to Christopher, he then heard Nixon tell Nisan to start shooting. "You're supposed to know what to do when you see him," Nixon reportedly said to his younger brother. Nisan then reached into his pants, and it was at that point Christopher pulled out his fully loaded handgun and fired recklessly at the 5 men in the crowded food court. Cameras caught the 5 men making a run for it. Nisan ran in a southerly direction up the south escalators, leaving the Eaton Center. Robert Kata ran in a southerly direction into the Sport Check and exited the mall through the inventory room. Ahmed Nuri ran south and turned west into the central seating area of the food court and is later seen going up the south escalators. Ahmed Hassan is seen taking a few steps before collapsing after getting hit by gunfire. Nixon is seen on camera falling as he is peppered with bullets, with Christopher at one point standing over him and firing a few rounds into him at point-blank range. Out of the 14 bullets fired from Christopher Husband's gun, 8 of them hit Nixon. The ordeal was over in 13 seconds, but it left 24-year-old Ahmed Hassan dead and 5 innocent bystanders with bullet wounds. Connor Stevenson, a 13-year-old boy, was shot in the head. Tasnuva Mahmood was shot in the leg. Nicholas Calicones was shot in his upper thigh. Hannah Kim was struck in the finger, and lastly, a bullet grazed Ching Chen's stomach. Shortly after the shooting, Husbands can be seen running out of the mall and to his sister's Adelaide Street apartment, leaving his stunned girlfriend behind. Once he arrived at the apartment, he stuffed the gun under the bed, stripped out of his clothes, and threw them into a bag. He then turned on the TV and seen they were covering the shooting. He panicked and left the apartment, threw the duffel bag with his clothing into a bin outside a restaurant, and went to his girlfriend's house. She was in hysterics. Husbands left her place within minutes of arriving, went first to a nearby LCBO, bought a bottle of Hennessy, headed back towards his sister's apartment bewildered, not knowing what to do with himself. A friend drove by, said he'd heard about the shooting and that Husbands had been involved, and told him to hop in. Husband sits in the passenger seat for a few minutes before he decides he doesn't trust his friend, so he hops out the car at Park Lawn Road. Still carrying the gun he used in the shooting, Christopher grabs a rock and smashes the firearm into pieces, tossing some into the lake, the rest onto some rocks along the shoreline. Husband spent that night at another friend's house, drinking heavily, crashing on the couch, racking his brain over what to do. On the news, they said Ahmed Hassan was dead, and Nixon and Connor Stevenson were in critical condition. What Husbands realized quickly at that moment was that he needed a lawyer. He turned himself into police at 2:30 a.m., June 4th.
So what's your last name, please? Husbands. What is it? Husbands.
A week later, on June 11th, while in custody, Husbands learned that Nixon had died in hospital that day. He was quoted saying, "I was very affected. No matter what we went through, Nixon was my childhood friend. I was reflecting on when we were young, what we went through as we grew up." Moments after Nisan made his escape from the Eaton Center Mall, he called Nixon on his cell phone. He got no answer, but he assumed he made it out safely. That is until he turned on the news and seen Nixon getting carried out on a stretcher in front of a stunned crowd. 1 week later, 22-year-old Nixon succumbed to his injuries. He leaves behind his girlfriend, who at the time was pregnant with his son. This was the turning point for the remaining Nirmalendran brothers. Nisan and Nirusan looked up to Nixon. He always had their backs. He was their protector, and now that he's gone, they had no choice but to fend for themselves. 1 month after the Eaton Center shooting, 2 detectives from the Toronto Police Service Homicide Squad were assigned to locate and interview Nisan after the shooting. The officers waited in their unmarked car on July 9, 2012, near a probation office where Nisan was expected to report at 11 a.m. Shortly thereafter, they observed Nisan enter the probation office. When he left the office, the officers approached him and said they would like to speak with him on video about the Eaton Center shooting. Nisan initially declined, but when the officers offered to interview him by audio tape in their car, he agreed. The following is a summary of the transcript from that 50-minute audio statement. Nisan told the officers that in the 35 days since the shooting, he had watched news stories about the event. At one point he said, "I heard 1 gunshot, then I shot." There were no follow-up questions or clarifications as to what he meant by "I shot." It could possibly mean either that he ran away or that he fired a shot. Early in the statement, Nisan said if someone in his group was armed, they would have told one another. He later contradicted that statement. He was then asked about the ambush on Christopher Husbands. The media talks about the stabbing, but a lot of people know that Nixon had nothing to do with it. The word on the street is that Somalis did it. Some people know how to keep it to themselves and others talk, and it will come back to them, you know. Nisan proceeded to discuss the fact that Nixon could have been shot in Regent Park so many other times. He would be in Regent Park with no gun on him, just standing there smoking. There were so many times when someone could have run up and shot at him. The stabbing was in March and he was shot in June, and my brother was out on the streets. I know Husbands seen my brother before. Nixon even heard that Husbands had problems with people in the Regent Park area. The news said Mr. Husbands was on house arrest, but people saw him in the area of Regent Park hanging out in the last few months. He could have done it enough times when he saw my brother. It doesn't make sense. So he does it in the Eaton Center when a couple of guys are around my brother? Nixon wasn't targeted. I know he wasn't targeted or he would have been gone a long time ago. Why would it take 4 months after the stabbing when Mr. Husband seen him in the area enough times? Unfortunately, this would be the last time officers would hear from Nisan, because 8 months after providing this statement, tragedy would strike the Nirmalendrans once again.
It was a shocking crime that rocked our city. Now we're finding out there's a link between the Eaton Center shooting and Toronto's latest murder. Genevieve Tomney explains.
Just after 11 last night, paramedics rushed Nisan Nirmalendran to St. Mike's Hospital. Hours later, he would die there, succumbing to bullet wounds, just as his older brother Nixon did less than a year ago. Police confirming today the man killed in last night's shooting at a downtown seniors home is the younger brother of one of the victims of the Eaton Center shooting.
Obviously, anytime 2 members of a family are murdered, it causes concern for everyone. But
for now, police are not making a connection, but say the killing of 2 brothers in 1 year is a coincidence they cannot ignore.
Right now, early on, there's nothing that's jumping out that tells me that because of this has occurred. But we'll certainly explore that.
Meanwhile, at the crime scene, police are poring over surveillance video they say tells a disturbing story. Police say the video shows what happened in this vestibule, the killer chasing the victim into the small space. But also inside, an elderly woman who lives in the residence, trapped by coincidence in what police call a cat and mouse game, where the victim appeared to use her as a human shield. The woman was unharmed, but residents of the building have been left shaken.
The bangs.
What did it
Three
sound
loud
like?
bangs woke both of us up. And I just told her that that's a heavy gun.
And wondering what young men would be doing in a seniors complex late at night.
There have been apartments broken into by the police for crack and there are youth in there, which is it's a seniors building. So I don't know how they get in there.
Police are wondering too. They say video shows Nirmalendran and a friend were inside the seniors' home for 2 hours before the shooting happened, but so far they can't make a connection to any residents. Investigators say they're looking for that friend who's pictured here, as well as at least one suspect who may have fled in a car or van.
On March 21st, 2013, at 9:15 p.m., Nisan is seen on camera entering a senior's apartment building on 55 Bleecker Street with another man who investigators believe is his friend. The friend is pictured wearing a white and black striped shirt or scarf and tries to hide his identity numerous times as he enters the building. Fast forward 2 hours, the pair left the building by another door, but a short time later, Nisan is again seen on surveillance video running frantically back and through the main entrance, followed by gunfire. Nisan can then be seen holding an innocent elderly woman who happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time as a shield, while a male suspect tries to shoot him. Although the woman was left unharmed, the same couldn't be said about Nisan. He tried to escape down the main lobby of the Toronto community housing property, but due to the severity of his injuries, he collapsed by the entrance. He was taken to hospital where he was pronounced dead, making him Toronto's 13th homicide victim of 2013. To this day, no suspects have been identified in the murder of Nisan, and his case remains unsolved. Once the details of Nisan's death were revealed to the public, rival gangs of Regent Park didn't hesitate to take shots at him on songs.
Everybody tweaking for a body. Scared niggas missing cause they tweaking off of Molly's. Niggas using old ladies as protection in the lobby. Wow. And still getting by.
After the murder of Nisan, the mother of the Nirmalendrans said her youngest born and last remaining child changed. During the Eaton Center trial, she provided a victim impact statement through an interpreter. When my sons were here, they used to sit together and eat and laugh together as a family. After my youngest son lost his brothers, he doesn't come near the table anymore. Her statement was so emotional, her interpreter began crying during translation. Nirusan wasn't coping with the loss of his two older brothers, and to make things worse, much like Nixon and Nisan, he became immersed in a life of crime as well. The same year Nisan was killed, Nirusan began dealing marijuana, all while in high school. This is how he earned his living up until August 14th. 2015, when he was caught on camera doing a drive-by at 463 Gerrard Street. Police allege the then 20-year-old Nirusan passed by in a vehicle, firing rounds at a group of men standing in front of the building. Security footage showed what appears to be Nirusan's arm holding the weapon, and a license plate registered to the Nirmalendrans, which police say led to his arrest. He was convicted on an array of weapons offenses and was released by 2018. Knowing he had been given another opportunity to turn his life around, Nirusan made the most of it. He moved from Regent Park to Scarborough and began working various random jobs, mainly as a general laborer in the construction industry, but with his criminal record, he couldn't hold the job for longer than a month. This is when he decided to venture back into the drug trafficking business. He built a drug program in St. Catharines sometime in early 2019 and used the profits to build another program in Toronto. This is when he met his criminal associate, O'Day Bazuir. 21-year-old O'Day was just recently released from prison after being convicted of an armed bank robbery in Peel Region, and Nirusan deemed him fit to be a part of his drug program in Toronto. Unfortunately, their partnership didn't last long, because come December that same year, the two transitioned from being drug traffickers to cold-blooded murderers.
Police got the call just before 3. Police towed a car from the scene, but it's unclear it's connected to the case.
26-year-old Koshin Yusuf is a man of many talents. When he graduated from high school, he moved to China where he enrolled at Wuhan University for computer science. Here's where he learned to speak fluent Mandarin and worked his way up to become an ESL teacher, all while completing his computer science program. He started several successful web design businesses while in China, but eventually returned to Toronto to care for his mother and younger brother who has autism. At the end of 2019, Koshin sent his mother and 2 siblings to Mecca for 2 weeks, a trip he had paid for in full. Unfortunately, while there, Koshin's family would receive devastating news. Koshin was murdered. According to police, 2 armed men cornered him just outside the entrance to his apartment building at 400 McCowan Road and opened fire. He received 24 separate gunshot wounds, inflicted by 2 separate weapons, each in the hand of one of the assailants. A video surveillance camera recorded the entire incident from beginning to end. It even caught the moment the 2 men arriving at the victim's apartment building after parking their Hyundai Elantra on Blue Lagoon Court. This was the first of many mistakes the 2 gunmen made that fateful night. 24 hours after the shooting, investigators managed to link the Hyundai to Nirmalendran. He had rented out the vehicle in his name, wrote down his real address, and paid for it using his personal credit card 2 days before the shooting. That's not all. Unbeknownst to Nirusan, the vehicle was fitted with a GPS tracking system, which investigators managed to pull the data from. By tracking the GPS location of the Elantra moments after the shooting and reviewing multiple video surveillance cameras, the vehicle was found to have stopped at 3 different locations. First, 228 Galloway Road, then 4100 Lawrence Avenue East, and lastly, 30 Gilder Drive. The suspects stopped at a building on 228 Galloway Road to pick up an unknown package, then drove to a building on 4100 Lawrence Avenue East. One of the gunmen got out of the vehicle and entered the building. He was seen moments later returning to the front entrance and getting into a lift. He was dropped off at an apartment on 415 Willowdale Avenue, the same apartment O'Day Bazuhair happened to live in. Meanwhile, the other gunman drove all the way to a residence in St. Catharines, picked up another package, and drove back to 30 Gilder Drive. 30 Gilder is an apartment building in Scarborough which Nirusan happened to live in with his father, and the same building he provided the car rental business as his home address. With the vital information obtained from the tracking system of the Elantra, the information provided by the car rental business, and the numerous video surveillance cameras around the scene of the crime, Toronto police felt they had enough evidence to begin requesting search warrants. The first one they received was for O'Day's residence. On January 15, 2020 at approximately 6 a.m., a search warrant was executed at his residence at 415 Willowdale Avenue. Inside, not only was O'Day found lying in bed, but a number of clothing articles that matched the outfit of one of the gunmen was found stashed on the floor right beside him. O'Day was subsequently charged with first-degree murder. 1 hour after O'Day's home was raided, Nirusan was informed by an unknown party of what was happening. In a panic, Nirusan called O'Day 5 times, completely unaware O'Day's cell phone had already been seized by police. Nirusan realized his plan was unraveling fast, so in a last-ditch attempt to evade the authorities, he went back to the place he rented the Elantra from, returned it, then rented another Elantra in a different color and with a different license plate. Nirusan also remembered his phone number was in O'Day's now seized phone, so under the assumption police would be able to track him through it, he purchased a new SIM card and swapped it with the old one. This was a complete lapse in judgment by Nirusan because police are still able to track your cell phone activities, even if you choose to swap SIM cards. Believing he was now safe, Nirusan went about his week as usual. Toronto police, on the other hand, was devising a plan to take him down. On January 29th, just 2 weeks after O'Day was arrested, Nirusan's residence at 30 Gilder Drive was raided. Inside, he was found in bed with a girl. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. With the substantial amount of evidence collected during the investigation, it didn't take long for a judge to find O'Day and Nirusan guilty of first-degree murder. When asked by Superior Court Justice N. Malloy if he had anything to say, the then 29-year-old Nirusan rose in his ill-fitting suit and addressed the downtown courtroom filled with the grieving relatives of Koshin Yusuf. "I would like to say, Your Honor, I did not do this." Nirusan and O'Day were then sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. The Nirmalendran brothers came to Canada, dreaming of a better life. Now 2 are gone and the youngest is serving life in prison. Their story is a tragic one, but it's a stark reminder of just how much the streets can take. I hope everyone watching can learn the devastating consequences of the streets and the cycle it perpetuates, not just on individuals, but on families and communities.